Chit Chat, our weekly show where we discuss the top developments across the world in the last 7 days with our guest and expert, Suzivesh Singh Meni. Thanks very much, sir, for being here today. So at the top, I'd like to focus on the China issue. China's facing many problems. There's a financial crisis that's unfolding there. Its property giant Evergrande is facing a debt crisis. Then the Chinese authorities have imposed some sanctions and sanctions on emissions. So all of this is now snowballing into a financial crisis over there. Can you shed more light on what's happening in China?
Okay, so this is to do with the course corrections which President Xi Jinping had sought to bring, in the Chinese economy. So whether you look at the property sector, whether you look at lending, for the real estate sector and all, the obviously in the last few years, the Chinese government has tightened its lending regulations for real estate, and with the intention of basically bringing about a course correction, because there had been as in the last few decades, with economic growth, you witnessed a significant rise in property prices like in other countries. So the first thing is that, that is what is in a normal situation. Maybe a few years ago, if this problem was there, Evergrande would have not faced the challenge of getting, assistance from banks and all. So the first problem is that the tightening of regulations with regard to lending real estate. I mean, that's one problem which because I think the debt is estimated as 313 billion USD. Now we need to keep a few points in mind. Evergrande employs 4 million people, right? So any collapse or anything, first of all, it directly impacts 4 million people. That's one. When we look at the Chinese economy. Second, if you look at the liabilities, there are 120 banks and 130 other non-banking financial institutions with which Evergrande is linked. So it has an impact on that right away. Okay. Then its offshore liabilities, bond liabilities, are estimated at about 19 billion, right? And it has been faltering even on the offshore payments of late. In fact, it was to make one, I think yesterday it was unable to do so, right? Now, if you look at, so if Evergrande collapses, this has an impact on the Chinese real estate sector as a whole. Now, 3/4 of Chinese household incomes are invested in real estate. So you can see how it will impact the Chinese economy. Then you look at, if you look at the Chinese market, obviously it is a major consumer of commodities, right? So the commodities markets globally will also be impacted. While we are looking at the stock market, that last week the Dow Jones index fell and all that. But what about the commodities market globally, right? So there are multiple challenges now. Will it, whether it is going to be linked, whether you can compare it to the 2008 economic crisis, a lot of people are arguing that that's a bit of a stretch, but it's certainly because Evergrande had stretched itself so much. It was not only linked to real estate, it was involved in various numerous other projects. So I think it could have serious implications. And as I said, especially for the commodities markets and in terms of financial institutions also, with the linkages which it has. So at this point of time, and the Chinese government, though analysts are saying that the Chinese government won't step in, I think the central bank also stepped in. They have pumped in 18.6 billion USD into the market to try and solve this problem. But this has now a lot will depend upon the assistance from the government. A lot will depend upon how the government also reacts to the fact that now there are twin challenges, as we will be discussing, of power cuts, what impact that is having on the economy. So will there be a bit of a course correction in the approach of the government? That's one thing which we need to look at. Comparison to 2008 may at this point of time be a bit of a stretch.
Why do you think the cut in emissions, the strict cut in emissions has been imposed at this juncture by the authorities?
I think these commitments had been made earlier by President Xi Jinping on global platforms in 2020 itself. And as you've been discussing earlier, China wanted to send out a message that it believes in multilateralism, and also in the realm of, in the fight against the reduction of carbon emissions, that China is a responsible player. And it was also to do with the domestic part. One is a course correction with regard to real estate, with regard to a curb on, if you look at wealth also, the exponential rise of a few individuals. Along with that, obviously, environment was also an important priority. So one is a domestic side. Second is globally, you wanted to send out a message, right? Now, what has happened is, again, there are a number of problems together. What has happened is that after the lockdown, after the removal of restrictions, suddenly, naturally, demand has risen for various commodities. Economic activities have picked up. So demand for power has risen on the one hand, and also on the other hand, you have this thing about reducing your, if you look at coal prices, they have also gone up. And then there's this talk about, the government has actually has asked a lot of industries to reduce their activities also. So what that is doing is, in certain places, certain states, for instance, which are industrially very provinces and Chinese provinces, in Jiangsu province, for instance, number of companies have actually shut down. So, if you look at Jiangsu, Guangdong, and they account for a significant percentage of the overall economic activity in China. And they are facing this crisis, So obviously that is going to hit the economy. Now, one part is about, the domestic. Then coming back to the global, Xi Jinping had also said that he wants to, the Chinese, he wants absolutely blue skies when China actually hosts the Winter Olympics in February. So it's multiple. But again, now what is going to happen is, once you have, if companies close down, right? Again, there's a lot of dependence upon commodity, obviously, like things like textiles, steel, and even, commodities like toys. There's a global demand. So once you have companies shutting down or companies reducing their production, obviously the global market is going to be impacted. The global economy is going to be impacted. We live in a global village. Now, the point is that, you can obviously say whether it's less or whether it's more. It depends upon the level of integration of other countries, which are dependence upon China, which most countries have, at least in certain commodities. While post the pandemic, there has been a push towards reducing dependence upon Chinese goods and commodities. And there was this talk about, altering supply chains. That has, so far, number of countries have realized it's not easy to do so. So this will have an impact. And I think what happens is, I think this is also a lesson that you do need disruptions, but sudden disruptions that can at times be problematic. So, for instance, if you wanted to curb carbon emissions, you probably did not foresee that there'll be another crisis also alongside. So this poses twin challenges. And obviously, in the Western world, you're seeing questions about, the Chinese economic model and so on and so forth. But I think at this point of time, they will be able to deal with it. And the world also can't afford that these twin problems actually, they exacerbate further and, cause any problems.
Correct. So do you see this, the Chinese shrinking, the manufacturing sector kind of coming to a standstill there, opening up newer avenues for countries like India?
See, last year, there was after the COVID-19 pandemic, there was talk about, as I said, even within the Indo-Pacific, there has been this discussion about, changing the supply chains, reducing dependence upon China. India, after last year in 2020, a number of companies which were relocating from China, some of them moved to India, but the biggest beneficiary has been Vietnam and other Southeast Asian nations as well, because of certain economic policies, because of the cost of labor, because of the proximity to China, because of geographical location and all. But yes, there can be some benefits in the longer run, not in the short run, not in the imminent future.
Okay. So shifting our focus now to Afghanistan, sir, which has dominated our conversation for the longest time. Distressing news has been emerging from that country regularly. There are public executions. The Taliban has gone back to, outdated models of administering justice. Even children haven't been spared. So there's widespread violation of human rights. What should the international community be doing? What are your observations?
So I think there are some encouraging signs which often get, obliterated. And, first of all, if you look at Taliban in terms of air connectivity, they've spoken about resumption of air connectivity. Specifically with India also, they've said that, resumption of commercial flights. So I think in the geopolitics of the region itself, the fact that Afghanistan has reached out directly to India, now how India reacts to it, that. Second, I think there's also a realization, I think, which is a welcome realization in the global community, that you need to distinguish between the interim government and you need to distinguish between the Afghan people. Because even according to estimates, 18 million Afghans were dependent upon assistance, financial assistance and everything from before the Taliban had actually taken over. There's a danger of at least 1 million Afghan children under the age of 5 actually seriously could possibly face malnutrition. So these are just figures. Now the United Nations has been pushing the world community towards paying greater attention to the humanitarian crisis. And in a meeting which they held in September, donors had committed over 1 billion for dealing with these humanitarian challenges. Now, and fact, I mean, no country has opposed humanitarian assistance. Last week, even the US said that, we won't, as far as humanitarian assistance to Afghanistan is concerned, the US Treasury has actually issued 2 licenses, which will ensure that there are no impediments to the humanitarian assistance, whether through US organizations or whether through multilateral bodies like the UN and all that. So that is a welcome sign. Now, the debate also is that whether China is saying that you should even remove, because the US has said that impediments to humanitarian assistance will be removed, but the existing sanctions on the Taliban, and dealings with the Taliban, obviously, you're not going to remove. And also assets of the Afghan central bank, which are overestimated over 9 billion. They have obviously been frozen. So China is saying that you should reverse this decision. And about 7 billion of these reserves, I think 7.5 are in various forms like gold, and it's not only the assets are in a diversified sort. They have a diversified sort of nature. That is one thing which you need to remember. So now, whether I think this is going to be a major point of debate between China and other countries, whether the sanctions should also not be removed. Humanitarian assistance now, everybody realizes the challenge, and UN has actually been pushing the envelope that you should help out more. But I don't think the US is going to as yet remove sanctions, because not just the US, even Russia, even Iran have been repeatedly saying that the Taliban should fulfill its commitments with regard to an inclusive government, with regard to the rights of minorities, as you had said, rights of women and all. And there have been some major problem areas which have even been sort of acknowledged by China. Right. So I think the sanctions part, it remains to be seen. But yes, the humanitarian crisis, it is imperative for everyone to play an important role in this. And I think even Russia had said that they will be providing humanitarian assistance. So the other problem is that also about refugees. This is going to also be major, because there's already, Iran is home to a large number of Afghan refugees. Already a number of Afghans are looking at the option of crossing over, through the Afghanistan-Iran border and moving into Iran. So then that also has important regional implications, the refugee problem, a refugee sort of crisis, if that arises. So there are multiple layers to this whole issue.
And quickly, I would like you to just touch upon the Quad summit last week. We discussed about the security concerns raised there that dominated headlines. But then again, a section of media was saying that Quad is not the security grouping that was meant to be, because matters like COVID and climate change also took precedence. And what do you think, sir? It is a grouping beyond security concerns. So how important are these matters?
Yeah, so I think that is, the Quad needs to expand. First of all, obviously, technically, Quad includes 4 countries. The debate is whether you should actually be bringing in more countries on board. You can call, I don't know what to call it, but you need more, because there are actually other important countries, just stakeholders, which are not really part of this grouping. right? That is the one thing which you need to look at. The second is the more, if your agenda is more comprehensive, you send out a clear message. While there was mention of, obviously, if you look at the joint statement about the South China Sea, about the threats emanating from China, without mentioning China, about the security threats and everything. But this time there was also focus, as you said, one was on vaccines, COVID-19, cooperation in space, cooperation on 5G technologies, setting up a group to monitor, the infrastructural projects. So which means Quad has also been in discussions with regard to alternative infrastructure projects. Now, the problem is that, what is happening is, on the one hand, there are a lot of bilateral issues between the members of Quad. So, for instance, India and US, they have some trade issues. India and Australia, whether people in public, it comes out on the issue of, Australia not opening up borders for Indian students is a major issue. We always talk about the big ticket items, but these are major issues. Then Japan also is uncertain. Now, Japan has a new prime minister. It depends upon what, line he takes. Okay. Then the aspect of the China factor, to what extent are countries willing to go against China? So there are major issues which actually need to be addressed within this. Not just even before AUKUS, it was important to see, to address these issues. Now, one way is to find, it doesn't look glamorous, but having low-hanging fruits. So I think, for instance, one thing which is a good idea is about having scholarships for STEM students from Quad countries. But there again, if you look at between India and Australia and India and US, the issue of students, whether because of closed borders or whether because of student visa regulations. So these things, I think, if you look, for instance, if you look at the BRI, how China has used BRI, China has used the BRI also to further its soft power, giving scholarships to students, countries which are part of the BRI, giving fillip to tourism, so Quad needs to have that component. And obviously, I think, yes, nobody wants, that whole notion of Quad being in a military alliance and everything. At least India is not comfortable with that. So in that context, you have to have non-traditional security items. You need to have more issues even for economic cooperation. Now, the problem is that there is no clear, there is no economic architecture within which all the Quad countries can cooperate. You also need some economic architecture. So, for instance, now even the US itself is out of the the CPTPP. Now, China is, in fact, while US is out of that, China is looking to join at CPTPP. India is not really part of any of these organizations. So the economic architecture also, unless there is an economic architecture in place, you cannot really push things, because you may be able to do things bilaterally, you may be able to do things trilaterally. And the other thing is, it's the leadership which also all countries need to send out a clear message that, okay, security issues are important, but there are ultimately, if you look at China's strategic cloud, also because of economic issues, economic cooperation, the economic component needs to be pushed. And even if you're looking at areas like technology, there need to be some tangibles. You can say that 5G is, obviously cooperation is important, but results are what matter. Now, as far as infrastructure is concerned, if the BBW can pick up, and countries can do things, that is important. I think the best bet, for instance, is if you look at South Asia and Southeast Asia, India, Japan, and the US can work together as far as infrastructural projects are concerned. So there, and already there was, even during the last Democrat administration, I think it was then Secretary of State John Kerry, who had spoken about an Indo-Pacific economic corridor. So the economic aspect needs to be looked at, and even the soft power aspect needs to be looked at, because BRI is very the way the vision has been articulated. That is very, I think, very astute in that sense. While obviously there's a clear strategic aim, but it has a very strong component of what we dub as soft power, or maybe smart power at the most.
Right, sir. Thank you very much for your analysis today. And thanks to our viewers for tuning in. Do stay tuned for our next episode next week for more analysis on global issues.